On November 14, 2189, at precisely 4:12 hours, the wind swept across the shattered plains of Virelia, carrying with it the metallic scent of smoldering wreckage and the faint, trembling echo of distant artillery. In that dim pre-dawn hour, where the last stars still flickered like dying signal lamps, a lone human soldier stood amid the ruins of a frontier outpost whose name had been erased by fire. Frost clung to the twisted beams, and the ground quivered with the memory of violence. Somewhere between the stillness and the lingering smoke, a single cry rose, thin, wavering, impossibly out of place in a world torn open by war. The place was known only on military charts as Sector Greyfall, a bleak valley encircled by jagged mineral cliffs that glowed faintly under the first hint of morning. It had been contested ground for months, a corridor through which armies moved like storm fronts, leaving scars that refused to heal. On that morning, the cold was sharp enough to stiffen breath, and every surface shimmered with a pale glaze that reflected the dying fires of the night's assault. It was here, in the crackling stillness, that a new chapter of the conflict first began to gather its weight. The cry had not sounded like the voice of an enemy. It carried no threat, no defiance, only the raw fear of a young life caught between forces vast enough to swallow entire worlds. Ren's boots crunched over shattered glass as he approached, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Smoke drifted in languid spirals from the wreckage, mingling with the bitter scent of reactive fuel. When he reached the source of the cry, he found what intelligence reports insisted was impossible. An enemy child, scarcely larger than his forearm, curled beside the scorched hull of an escape pod. Ren hesitated, not from hatred, but from the sudden weight of responsibility pressing against his ribcage. This moment, this impossible meeting between soldier and child, would become the hinge upon which the coming conflict would turn. Every breath, every tremor of the earth, seemed to deepen the gravity of the choice before him. The war had trained him to recognize threats, yet the tiny life before him was no weapon. It was a fragment of innocence left behind in the retreat of a shattered battalion. The sky brightened, revealing streaks of violet dust drifting on the wind, remnants of alien plasma that shimmered as it dissipated. Far beyond the cliffs, the low hum of carrier engines vibrated against the morning air, signaling the withdrawal of enemy forces. Ren knew he had but moments to act before reconnaissance teams swept the area. The child shivered, its pale skin luminescent beneath the settling ash. It reached out toward him, not as foe to foe, but as something else entirely, something stripped of the lines that war had drawn between their species. He lifted the child with careful, deliberate movements, feeling the fragile rhythm of its breath against the cold plates of his armor. The world around him seemed to shift, as though the valley itself recognized the gravity of what he had done. In the chronicles of war, decisions like these rarely survived the telling, yet this one would echo through every subsequent chapter. Ren turned toward the remnants of the outpost, carrying the small life that had no place in the grim machinery of conflict. The wind intensified, sweeping through the skeletal remains of vehicles and shattered barricades. Each gust carried the distant growl of approaching drones, their engines pulsing like mechanical heartbeats in the far-off ridgelines. Ren pressed forward, boots sinking into ash-thick mud, the child held close as though shielding it from the very memory of battle. Behind him, dawn crept over the horizon, casting long, stark shadows that stretched like fault lines across the ground. The deeper he moved into the valley, the more the landscape revealed the devastation wrought in the night. Towers lay folded upon themselves, charred cables hung in snarled coils, and the earth was pitted with impact craters that still radiated warmth. Yet within that destruction, something else emerged, a subtle shift in the air, a sense that history had begun to reorient itself around a single fragile life rescued from the ruins. Ren's breath clouded in the cold as he pressed forward, guided by instinct rather than command. The moment would later be marked as the genesis of an unprecedented chapter in the conflict, a turning point not defined by tactical brilliance or martial strength, but by a gesture of protection extended across the gulf between worlds. Reports would later probe every detail of these minutes, tracing the origins of an encounter that would ripple through diplomatic chambers, battlefield command posts, and the deepest reaches of alien memory. Yet none of that complexity touched Ren in that hour. He knew only that a child, enemy or not, had been left to perish unless he intervened. As the sun rose fully above the cliffs, its pale light illuminated the first signs of pursuit. Alien reconnaissance patterns moved with the precision of migrating shadows along the ridge crest. Ren felt the air thicken with tension, each passing second tightening around him like a closing fist. But he did not falter. The child stirred faintly, its small voice a whisper against the rising wind. In that fragile sound, Ren glimpsed the first trace of what the future would demand of him. Thus began the chain of events that would carry him from this desolate valley to the heart of an alien command, where the mother of the rescued child, one of the most formidable figures of her people, would summon him with a force that shook the foundations of both societies. The Valley of Greyfall became the opening chapter, etched into the annals of two worlds, its cold dawn remembered as the hour when one soldier's act of protection reshaped the fate of empires. In the quiet that followed, destiny advanced with measured steps none could yet perceive fully. The events that unfolded after the dawn at Greyfall Valley did not begin with declarations or diplomatic messaging. They began with movement, slow, deliberate, and burdened with the knowledge that every step forward carried consequences that no soldier's manual had prepared Ren to face. The child he carried had not yet opened its eyes fully to the world, yet it had already rearranged the lines of war, pulling them into new shapes as if its very existence defied the logic of conflict. And as the sun rose higher, the valley began to give way to broader fields scarred by months of relentless fighting. Ren made his way toward the retreating human lines, knowing that the presence of an enemy life in his arms would trigger suspicion, interrogation, and perhaps condemnation. Yet he continued without hesitation, driven not by loyalty to command, but by an instinct older than the machinery of war. The child's breathing was faint, the rhythm shallow, yet each exhale warmed through the cold plates of his armor. The sensation grounded him. In that warmth, he felt the first threads of a bond that would soon redefine not only his fate but the fragile balance between warring civilizations. Human forward scouts spotted him first. Their silhouettes emerged from behind armored barricades, weapons raised with trained precision. Ren did not stop. He walked with calm certainty, allowing them to see exactly what he carried. The scouts faltered, exchanging looks of disbelief as if questioning whether the battlefield haze had twisted their perception. Protocol dictated that they should seize him immediately, but something in the manner of his approach, steady, composed, radiating an unspoken gravity, held them in place as he crossed the final stretch. When he finally reached the forward camp, the atmosphere tightened like a drawn cord. Soldiers gathered in a widening circle, their faces tense with confusion and distrust. Some murmured that he had captured a strategic asset, others whispered accusations of treason. Yet the child made no sound. It remained curled against Ren's chest, its luminescent skin reflecting the pale light of the human encampment. The officers who arrived shortly after took one look and understood the situation's complexity. The chain of command would not tolerate emotional interpretation, but neither could it ignore the implications of an enemy offspring rescued by a frontline soldier. Ren was ordered to the command tent, where his superior officers awaited. The interior was dimly lit, illuminated only by low holographic displays flickering with troop movements and shifting territorial markers. The air inside smelled of damp canvas, ration steam, and the unmistakable tension of rapid strategic recalibration. He placed the child gently on a thermal medical pad, its small form dwarfed by the equipment around it. No officer dared touch the delicate life, though each leaned in as if gravity pulled them toward the silent question hovering in the air. Why? Ren explained what he had found. He described the shattered escape pod, the battlefield's ruin, and the cry that had cut through the smoke. He did not attempt to justify his actions with emotion. He spoke plainly, as was expected of a soldier who had seen too many dawns like the one in Greyfall. The officers listened with stern expressions, yet beneath their discipline lay the quiet realization that this moment could not be contained within standard military protocol. The child was more than a survivor. It was evidence of vulnerability within an enemy believed to be impenetrably disciplined. It was also a catalyst, one that might ignite consequences none of them could yet predict. Their decision was cautious but inevitable. The child would be kept alive until high command reached a verdict. Ren was to remain with it, not as guardian but as a containment measure, ensuring the situation did not veer into uncharted territory without oversight. Human medics examined the child with both awe and scientific detachment. They took no risks, their movements methodical, their expressions touched by the faint hesitation of those encountering something both fragile and foreign. As the hours passed, word of the rescue spread through the human ranks. Soldiers whispered about the enemy's offspring, speculating on its significance. Questions rippled from tent to tent, carried on voices rough from battle. Some believed the child was a strategic prize, others a harbinger of retaliation. Yet no matter the perspective, all shared a lingering unease. War forged certainty through division, and the presence of something that transcended that divide unsettled the very foundation of their purpose. What no human soldier realized was that across the distant ridges of the valley, the alien forces had also taken note of the missing child. Their scanning devices picked up the faint heat signature of the downed escape pod hours after Ren had departed. By dawn's full rise, their commanders had pieced together the truth. The child, an offspring of one of their ranking strategists, was alive, somewhere within human control. Shock rippled through the alien battalions. Fierce as they were on the battlefield, they held their young with a reverence that defied human assumptions. The loss of a child was not simply a tragedy, it was an insult to the continuity of their lineage. Viral, the matriarch, mother of the child and commander of the alien vanguard, felt the quake of that revelation with the force of a blow. She was known among her people not only for tactical brilliance, but for the ferocity with which she defended her lineage. To her, the child was not merely kin, it was the essence of her future legacy. Rage surged within her, cold and controlled, guiding her toward a single unshakable conclusion. She would retrieve the child, regardless of the obstacles, regardless of the cost. Her first move was not an attack. It was a message. Near sunset, the human camp received its first signal, an encoded pulse in the atmosphere, unmistakably alien yet stripped of hostility. The humans gathered around their instruments, tense, unsure whether to interpret it as a threat or a negotiation attempt. When the translation came through, astonishment swept the command staff. There were no demands, no ultimatums. Only 4 stark words, delivered with the gravity of a vow. Return what was lost. The humans debated deep into the night. Some believed surrendering the child would be a show of weakness. Others feared retaliation if they did not. Ren, kept at the periphery of the debate, watched the child sleep, its breathing softer now, its faint glow dimming as the cold night deepened. He felt a tension building inside him, not born of fear but of responsibility. He had not rescued the child to create a symbol of leverage. He had done it because no battlefield should decide the fate of a life so small. When morning arrived, the alien forces made their second move. Their vanguard descended in perfect formation, hovering above the valley with deliberate restraint. It was not an assault. It was a presence, a reminder of what waited should negotiation fail. Their ships cast long shadows over the landscape, darkening the human encampment like the wings of an approaching storm. Soldiers stiffened at their posts, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Viral herself descended from the lead vessel, her figure towering, her movement fluid with the grace of a creature accustomed to command. She did not approach with guards. She stepped forward alone, her gaze unblinking, her aura radiating an authority that made even veteran soldiers tighten their grips on their weapons. Ren emerged carrying the child. For a moment, the two opposing figures faced one another across a silent expanse. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying dust and lingering smoke. The camp held its breath. Viral's gaze locked onto her offspring, and something ancient, fierce, and unspoken reflected in her posture. She extended her arms, not in command, not in threat, but in the quiet gesture of a mother reclaiming her future. Ren stepped forward, reluctant yet resolute, placing the child into her grasp. The exchange should have ended there. But Viral did not retreat. She studied Ren with eyes that shimmered like polished obsidian, seeing not the armor he wore but the decision he had made in the ruins of the valley. For her people, acts of protection carried weight, binding weight. By her culture's laws, he had stepped into a pact older than war itself. Her voice echoed, low, resonant, undeniable. You safeguarded what is mine. Now you answer to me. The words were not a threat. They were a summons. And thus began the next chapter of the war, one shaped no longer by weaponry, but by obligation, honor, and a bond forged in the ashes of Greyfall. In the months that followed the exchange at Greyfall Valley, the war did not immediately quiet, nor did the ancient distrust between the two species dissolve into diplomatic certainty. Yet something had shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably, as if the war itself had recognized the weight of the moment when a lone human soldier placed an enemy child into the arms of its mother. The valley where it happened became a place soldiers spoke of in low voices, as though the air around it still held the vibration of vows unspoken and lines rewritten. Ren's departure from human command was not marked by banners or commendations. It was a quiet release, more like the closing of a door than the sending forth of an emissary. He walked alone from the encampment, following the alien vanguard as they ascended into their waiting ships. Human eyes watched from behind armored partitions, uncertain whether they were witnessing a transfer of authority, a diplomatic handover, or the beginning of an unimaginable burden placed upon a single soldier. None could say for certain what held him to the path he had chosen, but they felt its gravity nonetheless. For Ren himself, the journey was one of stillness more than motion. As the alien vessel lifted him away from the worlds he had known, he found himself navigating an unfamiliar silence, one painted with the distant hum of alien machinery, the faint pulse of luminous corridors, and the soft whispers of a child not yet recovered from the ordeal. He felt neither prisoner nor guest. Instead, he existed in a liminal state, suspended between the war he had served and the duty he had earned through a single act of protection. Viral kept her distance in those early days, not out of disdain but out of calculated caution. She was a commander first, and a mother second. Every decision she made carried ripples across her people's calculated strategies. Observing Ren from afar, she weighed the depth of his resolve, the sincerity of his instinct, and the strength of a character shaped not by allegiance but by responsibility. In her species, such traits were rare, even sacred, worthy of command, worthy of shaping futures, worthy of honoring through bonds etched deeper than treaties. As the child regained strength, its luminous skin brightened, its small hands reaching outward with curiosity restored. Ren found himself drawn to these moments, not as caretaker but as witness. He understood then that the threads binding him to this life were no longer singular choices but a chain of inevitabilities. Through his protection, he had woven himself into the narrative of a people unfamiliar yet now inseparably connected to him. And through that child's survival, the war had gained a new axis, one that neither side had anticipated. The first signs of change emerged not on battlefields but in the movements of fleets halting short of engagements, in scouting parties withdrawing before skirmishes could ignite, in the quiet hesitations of commanders who sensed that the war's momentum had begun to strain beneath unseen forces. Reports filtered through human channels of alien battalions repositioning, not toward human strongholds but away from them, as though waiting for something yet undefined. And on the alien side, Viral's influence began to curve strategies into unfamiliar shapes, preventing escalation where lesser leaders might have pressed forward. It was not peace, yet it was not war as it had been. Ren's role within the alien command structure evolved slowly, shaped by observation rather than instruction. He learned their ways not through language but through patterns, the cadence of their council debates, the subtle gestures that signaled respect or disagreement, the rhythm of decisions handed down from leaders whose very forms seemed carved from the material of stars. And as he moved within this system, Viral watched him with a commander's scrutiny and a mother's gratitude, recognizing in him a force that could reshape more than a single life. She summoned him often, not to direct orders but to conversations steeped in history, philosophy, and the delicate balance between power and survival. Through these exchanges, Ren began to understand that her summons at Greyfall had not been a demand of authority but an invocation of a cultural principle centuries older than the war itself. By protecting her child, he had stepped into an unbreakable chain of obligation, one that bound his fate to hers in ways neither species could easily translate. Word of this bond traveled through alien ranks with reverence. Among humans, it traveled with fear. Many questioned his allegiance, suspecting manipulation or coercion. Yet those who had witnessed the exchange at Greyfall spoke of something different, something rare. They described the stillness of that moment, the deliberate precision of Viral's movements, the unmistakable silence in which the valley itself had seemed to listen. To them, the bond was not treason, it was history in the making. And history, once shaped, cannot be unshaped. Months turned to seasons. Movements across the front slowed, then paused, then settled into an uneasy quiet. Negotiators on both sides spoke of temporary ceasefires, guided by whispers of influence traced back to Viral and the human soldier at her side. While no treaty had yet been penned, the war's relentless momentum had shifted into a holding pattern, like a great machine waiting for its next command. Ren did not seek recognition for this subtle transformation. He asked for nothing, demanded nothing. Yet through his presence, a space had formed where dialogue could exist, not as concession but as survival. Viral used this space with the precision of a master tactician, positioning her people not for conquest but for endurance, steering them away from the brink of mutual annihilation. In the final hours before the first formal negotiation summit, Ren stood again in a valley, not Greyfall, but another marked by the scars of war. The wind moved across the terrain with the same cold persistence, carrying the faint odor of distant fires and the quiet rumble of machinery powering down after years of ceaseless motion. He stood not as a soldier, not as emissary, but as a witness to the moment when two civilizations paused long enough to see themselves reflected in the fracture he had bridged. Behind him, Viral approached with her child resting against her arm. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence alone was testament to the bond that had formed, a bond that carried the weight of entire worlds. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Ren felt the quiet truth that would define the war's legacy. History is not forged only in battles won or leaders crowned. Sometimes it is forged in the fragile act of carrying a child through smoke and ruin, in the moment when one life is spared, and another chooses to honor that act. The war had not ended. Not yet. But its course had already changed, shaped by a decision made in the cold dawn at Greyfall, a decision that echoed still, deeper than orders, deeper than allegiance, deeper than the scars of conflict. The chronicles of future generations would look back on this era with astonishment, tracing its turning point not to strategy or weaponry but to a single act of protection that resonated across species, across borders, across the very fabric of history itself. And so the story closes not with triumph, nor defeat, but with the quiet certainty that even in war's darkest hours, a single human act can command the attention of empires, and alter the fate of civilizations. In the end, the battlefield fell silent, not because peace had been won, but because every soul present finally understood the cost of survival. The human soldier who once stood trembling before the alien mother had now become the bridge between two civilizations that had only known fear of each other. His act, protecting a child who was never his own, echoed louder than any weapon ever fired. The alien mother, once driven by vengeance, now carried a heavier burden, the truth that compassion could emerge from the very species she had sworn to destroy. Her people, watching from the shattered ridges above, saw not an enemy, but a possibility. As the dust settled and the twin moons rose over the broken landscape, the soldier turned toward the horizon. The future was uncertain, fragile, and riddled with unanswered questions. Yet something new stirred in the air, something that felt like the first breath of a world neither human nor alien, but something in between. And somewhere behind him, the alien child he had saved reached out, tiny fingers grasping hope. This was not the end of the war. But it was undeniably the end of something darker, and the first flicker of what might come next.